Hello, welcome to 5 Minute Lore. Today we'll be discussing some of the Lost Dwarf Holds from Warhammer Fantasy. I'll be discussing how they fell, their histories, and any other things I find interesting that's related to the holds. The first Lost Hold we'll be discussing is Mount Gunbad. Its old consulate name is unfortunately lost to time. Mount Gunbad was the wealthiest mine in the entirety of the Dawi kingdoms. So rich was this hold that it was exempt from participating in the War of the Beard. However, just because they didn't have to fight the abominable Elgi, it didn't mean they wouldn't participate in any conflict. Their hold would suffer earthquakes and eventually invasion from greenskins as they migrated from the Darklands into the World's Edge Mountains and the Badlands. Both Mount Gunbad and its sister hold, Carrick Agolwutra, also known as Mount Silverspear, would bear the brunt of the greenskin invasions. The Green Horde would ravage the dwarfs, sacking and razing all settlements around the two holds until they were the only ones left. For around 40 years, the greenskins would relentlessly attack the dwarves. Many Dawi and even more greenskin would die in this horrible bloodshed. Carrick Agolwutra was the smaller of the two holds, and many worried that they would fall soon. They had barely survived one large assault, and many thought they would not be able to take another one. The Dawi of Mount Silverspear prepared for another invasion and were anxiously awaiting the reinforcements from Mount Gunbad. Neither invasion nor reinforcements came. For some reason, the orcs of the White Orc tribe had lost interest in their hold. Scouts reported hearing the greenskins chant, more shinies," as they left. It seems someone had directed them elsewhere with rumor of more loot. The greenskins arrived at Mount Gunbad and began an attack on the surface of the hold. There were so many orcs that they physically pushed the Dawi back with their sheer mass alone. They weren't the only ones attacking the hold though. It turns out they heard of Mount Gunbad's riches from a conniving night goblin tribe, the Bloody Spears. As the orcs were attacking up top, the Bloody Spears would fight the dwarves in the tunnels. The combined forces were too much and the mighty hold had fallen. After the battle, the Bloody Spears would trick the White Orcs into thinking nothing was there and send them back off to Mount Silverspear because its name sounded richer. The Bloody Spears made the old Carrick their new home and it was now known as Mount Gunbad. Unfortunately for them, another tribe of goblins thought it was a nice home too and they fought over it for years. After a couple hundred years of recovering, the Dawi figured it was a good time to reclaim the lost hold, especially with the goblin infighting. So, a great throng of Dawi alongside the famous runesmith Cadron Redmane would arrive and successfully drive the Groby scum out of their home. The Dwarfen High King at the time, Morgan Blackbeard, would arrive to celebrate the return of the hold and tour the rich mines of the mountain. He picked an awful time for this though, as he was ambushed by the Bloody Spears in the mines. They had the king and his guards surrounded, slowly grinding them down and wearing them out. It'd only be a matter of time before the Bloody Spears slew the High King. Remember that Cadron Redmane guy I mentioned? He happened to be nearby, and despite not being a warrior, he grabbed this forging hammer and charged in to protect his king. The other runesmiths were inspired by his bravery and joined in. Together they managed to beat the goblins once more, saving the king. Cadron would be rewarded with a special hammer, and the High King would establish the Hammerers as his guard in his honor as well. While the Dawi had triumphed, it would not last long sadly. Mount Gunbad would fall once again, being too isolated to be protected properly. What was so special about Mount Gunbad that made the Dawi so desperate to hold it, you wonder? Well, as touched on earlier, it had massive gold deposits and was rich in many ores, one of those ores being Burnderaz or Brightstone. Brightstone is a deep blue color that glows in the dark, and it was used in the construction of many powerful weaponry. As such, it was very valued by dwarven craftsmen. So in basic terms, it looks pretty and has an actually useful function. The next hold we'll be discussing was primarily based on mining too, that hold being Carrick Varn, or as it's known now, Cragmere. Carrick Varn was located next to Blackwater Crater and was rich in Gromril. Gromril is a legendary metal that is rare, so naturally the dwarves were excited to establish a settlement near the Gromril and start mining it. The dwarves dug deep and greedily and paid for it in blood. They'd accidentally mined out parts of the underground lake and flooded the lower levels of their hold, killing many Dawi and losing many treasures. After this, they would try to be a bit more careful with their mining endeavors. During the War of the Beard, the king of Carrick Varn, Haradi Ironhand, was returning to Carrick Varn after failing to siege a High Elf settlement. While making the journey, he was ambushed by High Elves. During this battle, Ironhand had created the first Oathstone and died protecting it. Because of his sacrifice, many of his warriors managed to make it home, and the High Elves allowed their dwarven prisoners to bury Ironhand under his stone. His grave became a pilgrimage site for the Dawi. Many years after the War of the Beard, Carrick Varn would cite the first Skaven incursion on Dawi territory. The Skaven had managed to take much of the lower flooded levels of the hold, corrupting the Gromril into warpstone and the land around them, making it harder to live in for the Dawi in the area. Luckily, Cadron Redmane from earlier came along and evicted the Skaven from the hold temporarily. Key word here being temporarily, as Cadron would fall in battle against some orcs and the Skaven returned to the hold of his death. Poor guy just could not keep his victories. The Skaven would corrupt the region so much that Dawi would be forced to abandon their home. Some brave Dawi still go there, searching for Gromril or lost treasures in the lost hold. The last hold we'll be talking about is Carrick Ungor, also known as Red Eye Mountain. Also no, sorry to burst your bubble, but the hold is not named after a beastman, it means delving hold. This hold story is pretty similar to Cragmere's actually. Like Cragmere, Carrick Ungor had deep and rich mines, and so the Dawi did what they do best, and mined until there was a bunch of empty tunnels. There were so many tunnels that the dwarves lost track of them and just kind of forgot about it. After the War of the Beard, many Dawi holds would suffer earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other disasters. Carrick Ungor was no exception to this, and it was extra bad because of the vast tunnel networks underneath them. While the king of Carrick Ungor was on his way home from the war, the Red-Eyed tribe managed to sneak into the hold from these unprotected tunnels and conquer it. The king and his throng attacked the gate many times before eventually being forced to retreat. His own defenses had been used against him. After 500 years, the Dawi would try to recapture the hold once again, only to be repelled again. They made much progress capturing the gate and in the valley surrounding the region, but in the end they had to retreat. The battle would be known as the Battle of a Thousand Woes, and the King of the Hold had taken the Slayer oath in shame. The current Prince of Carrick Ungor, Ulthar Stonehammer, has not abandoned hope in retaking his people's home back and is an elite company of warriors known as the Dragon Company. He could be a possible hero for Carrick Cadron since you start so close to Red Eye Mountain in game. Honestly, I'm surprised the Red Eye tribe are such smart little sneakers. Maybe I'll start actually using their lore when I confederate them as Azhag out of respect. There are a bunch of Lost Dwarf holds as one would expect of a dying empire. I don't really have a reason for picking these three. I was considering doing Black Crag, but I figured in Carrick 8 Peaks have enough content to justify their own videos. So I picked some lesser known holds instead. It's pretty sad to read about all the Dwarfen losses, especially as a big Dwarf fan, but you have to admire their persistence in the face of ever-growing odds. If you enjoyed this video, I recommend you jump further down the Warhammer rabbit hole.